In the wake of the 2024 Iranian presidential elections, a victory for Masoud Pezeshkian could signal significant shifts in both domestic governance and international relations. His policies could reshape Iran's approach to regional dynamics and global diplomacy, marking a crucial turning point in the nation's trajectory. However, the new president will confront daunting domestic challenges, from economic strain to evolving social dynamics, all within Iran's complex political framework. Internationally, he will have to navigate regional tensions, nuclear negotiations, and geopolitical shifts. What economic and social reforms might the new president prioritize to address Iran's most pressing challenges? And what are the potential implications of the election results for international diplomacy involving Iran?
Dear esteemed audience, good evening. On behalf of the Emirates Center for Strategic Studies and Research, we are delighted to welcome you all to this webinar titled The Iranian Presidential Elections 2024 Domestic and International Trajectories. I'm Abdulrahman Al Haddadi, Deputy Sector Director for Strategic Studies and Research, and I'm honored to be the moderator for this evening's webinar. The victory of the reformist candidate Dr. Masoud Pezeshkian has triggered so many questions and speculations about the extent to which the new president-elect can introduce policy shifts domestically and internationally. While many observers believe that his ability to influence policy is heavily restricted by the constitutional barriers and the domestic power struggle, others believe in the opposite. They believe that by examining history, we can see a difference in comparison between the presidency of Khatami or the transition from presidency of Khatami to the presidency of Ahmadinejad. There was a change. And from Najad to Rouhani, also there was a change. And from Rouhani to Raisi, there was a change. So why not? There is no expected or potential change with Dr. Masoud Pezeshkian. To shed light on this topic, we are fortunate to have a very distinguished speakers who will provide an in-depth analysis of the potential domestic and international trajectories under the presidency of Dr. Pezeshkian. Before we move to our distinguished speakers, we would like to introduce them. Joining us from Washington, D.C., Mr. Ali Alfoneh, who is a senior fellow at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, a political scientist and expert in Iranian affairs. Mr. Ali Alfoneh has published so many articles and analysis, in addition to a book titled Political Succession in the Islamic Republic of Iran. Not too far from Abu Dhabi, joining us from Doha, Professor Mehran Kamrava, who is a professor of government at Georgetown University in Qatar. He's the author of several journal and articles and books, including a very popular book called or titled Righteous Politics, Power and Resilience in Iran, and Triumph and Disappear in Search of Iran's Islamic Republic. Last but not least, my colleague, Fatima, our third speaker. Ms. Fatima Al Zeyoudi is Deputy Director of the Middle East Affairs Department at the Emirates Center for Strategic Studies and Research, and a specialized researcher in Iranian affairs. She earned her bachelor degree in political science from UAE University, and now she's finalizing her master degree in intelligence analysis from Rabdan Academy. Welcome to all of you, our speakers, and we'd like to start our conversation today, which will be more of a conversation and a constructive discussion more than a lecture. And we'll start with the domestic environment in Iran in light of the recent elections. And I would like to start with you, Professor Mehran, with a very quick comparison between the elections in 2021 and the elections in 2024. In 2021, there was a reformist candidate, who was Mr. Abdel Nasser Hemmati. But we did not see the same level of support that Mr. Masoud or Dr. Masoud Pezeshkian received in this election. How can you interpret that lineup of all these political currents in Iran, apart from the conservatives, to support Dr. Masoud Pezeshkian? Please, Professor Mehran.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and an honor being here and to share the screen with such a distinguished group of colleagues. So thank you so much for having me. The 2021 elections were widely considered to have been engineered, that's the term used in Iran, to produce a particular result. They were meant to get Raisi elected. A whole bunch of potential opponents were disqualified by the Guardian Council. And Masoud and Hemmati, Abdel Nasser Hemmati, who was kind of the token reformist who was approved, came from the central bank. He didn't have charisma. He was a banker by trade rather than a seasoned politician. He didn't have stage presence. And, there was a sense of resignation among everyone that this election was deliberately designed to ensure Raisi's victory. And so in the 2024 elections, what we saw suddenly was kind of a token reformist was thrown in, Pezeshkian, but Pezeshkian turned out to be not just an excellent campaigner, but in many ways, really, he owed it to former foreign minister Zarif, former president Rouhani, all of whom suddenly came out of forced silence and retirement and excited the electorate. They scared the electorate about potential. إلى تعزيز فرصة Pezeshkian in a way that I don't think anyone expected. And so we saw this mass excitement. I think it's also important not to discount the Azeri vote. Pezeshkian is an ethnic Azeri, speaks, his mother tongue is Azeri. He was raised in area of Lorestan of Iran. So those votes, I think, were also critically important. And we saw that the political system, in many ways, in the second round at least, didn't interfere, neither in the first or the second round, interfered and let the other faction have a say, so that this is one of the ways in which the system maintains itself over time, allowing for the elites to rotate in and out of office.
Okay, so Professor, you say that his background, his ethnicity, and his linguistics, let's say, background has helped him. But I think also there's another part, which is the social and economic agenda that he was promoting through the campaign. And here I would like to move to Mr. Ali Alfoneh. Can you just walk us through this social and economic policy, and what is the potentials that he can succeed in implementing this policy in terms of all these complicities, domestic complicities, and the domestic policy in Iran?
Good evening to you all, and thank you so much for a kind invitation. More than 20 years ago, I read one of the articles of Professor Kamrava on civil-military relations, and that's actually, made me so interested in studying the role of the military in Iranian politics. So that's actually, if anybody's unhappy with my books and presentations and the like, do blame Professor Kamrava for inspiring me. That said, yes, I completely agree with Professor Kamrava. All elections in Iran are more or less engineered. This election too was engineered. But no one believed that Dr. Pezeshkian could become the star that he became. And nobody knew how effective he could be as a campaigner, with the help, obviously, from a political reformer like former President Khatami and an economic reformer like former President Rouhani. So all of these factors, I think, to a great extent, surprised the regime. So they suddenly had to face this formidable candidate. As for his social policy and his economic promises, he has promised to do something about Iran's peripheral regions. So he himself belongs to the Azeri minority, which, by the way, is a very, very powerful minority, and they have outsized influence over Iran's economy and politics. He wants to do something, and he promised to do something about Iran's peripheral regions. He promised to engage the ethnic and religious minorities in politics, economy, and society. I think these factors helped him mobilize some of the voters in the second round of the elections, because in the first round of elections, he too was facing difficulties. In Sistan and Balochistan province, the participation was 50% of what it was 3 years ago. In Iran's Kurdistan province, the election was almost half, than compared with 3 years ago. So even he was facing trouble in the first round of elections. In the second round, he did manage to mobilize some of those voters with promise of justice for all ethnic minorities. He also addressed the issue of women and the hijab issue, which is quite interesting. Because when he was a young man back at Tabriz University in 1979, he enforced, as a member of the Revolutionary Committee, he was one of the individuals enforcing hijab even before it was codified by the government of the Islamic Republic. Now, 45 years on, he believes that that was a wrong thing to do. He is talking about mistakes of the parents if young girls are not dressed appropriately. If young ladies are not abiding by the hijab legislation, he no longer believes that violent enforcement of the hijab is the solution. These things too, I think, managed to mobilize some younger people who would like to see social and personal freedoms. As for the economy, his promises, I think, were much more interesting for the unprivileged classes of society. What did he promise? He promised to increase the size of the cake of the economy, but he also promised more just distribution of wealth by making the subsidies much more directed to low-income families, and also by taking away universal basic income away from high-income families and redirect it to low-income families. So these promises too made him a candidate who was extremely attractive from several voting groups. Those who want personal freedom, like these young girls who went out protesting against violence enforcement of hijab legislation, but also unprivileged classes of society who are truly suffering under the sanctions regime.
Okay,
so because of these factors, I'm not so surprised.
But Mr. Ali Alfoneh, I just want to get Fatma's opinion on this. Fatma, now when we speak about the hijab, I think the revisiting the hijab law was not something that would be unique for Dr. Pezeshkian, because even during President Raisi, there was at the end of his tenure, there was some plans to reconsider the hijab law, and they started to at least give some relief for the people, because they started with a very tough policy, and then they started to maybe lesser the restrictions. So how do you see the Pezeshkian's opportunities in advancing the hijab policy?
The Iranian parliament...
I'll come to you, Mr. Ali. Just I will get Fatma's insight, and then I'll come back to you.
So during the Raisi's presidency, the hijab law was shifting from one parliamentary to another. They tried to avoid accepting this law because it was so strict, and they were afraid of implementing it in the society, and the people, women, therefore raise revolutions or so on the regime. And therefore it was too strict, because the laws, they were like fines on the woman, and also they were like immediate intervention from the security to people, to women. So the thing is, what I know at the beginning, that the term itself, bad hijabi, that they have hijab came from Raisi himself when he was in the legislation. So it was linked to Raisi himself as a person and as a government later on. Pezeshkian now he is coming with not having a strict hijab. And he means by that not intervention with the security to people, to women, but generally speaking, I don't think he will be able to push for canceling this law in the parliament, but more of like not implementing it, the same as the past governments.
Thank you, Fatima. Back to the economic policy, and here Professor Mehran, Mr. Ali was talking about the ambitious plans that Dr. Pezeshkian was promoting for his presidency. And one of the areas that he was talking about is how to support the private sector and how to maybe lessen the restrictions from the government over the economy. But this, in fact, might contradict with the role of the IRGC in the economy. So how can he reconcile his plans with the fact that the IRGC is strongly embedded in the economy?
Yes, the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, does have an economic empire, and it's got its tentacles all over the Iranian economy and the private sector, particularly in the petrochemical sector. But I think it's important to also remember a couple of things. First of all, the Iranian economy suffers from tremendous rent-seeking behavior, kind of parasitic, semi-private entities that live off the government. And if any president can curtail, if not necessarily change, some of this rent-seeking behavior, there's an awful lot of money that is then left behind. Now, one interesting thing we saw is immediately after his election was announced, suddenly the Tehran stock market, which was sliding down because of fears of a Jalili presidency, suddenly it reversed and it started climbing. And that shows the business community's confidence in the president-elect. And so one of the interesting things about about Pezeshkian has been the fact that he has tried to manage expectations. He has said, I'm not going to be able to turn the economy around overnight, but I can start to make marginal changes in some of the rent-seeking behavior, getting rid of some of the corrupt officials. And already what we've seen in the kind of criteria that he has presented for his selecting his ministers is that he has said at least 50 to 60% of my ministers need to be first-time ministers. They cannot have served in previous cabinets. So he's trying to present kind of a clean administration that would get rid of some of these rent-seeking behaviors, some of the corrupt practices that have become endemic in the Iranian economy.
Clear. Thank you so much, Professor. And moving to the regional arena, Ms. Fatma, in an attempt to understand what is the Iranian the regional policy going to be under Dr. Pezeshkian's presidency, what should we expect and what we should not expect?
Honestly, I believe that it's unlike the impact of or the change that the government can make in the international levels. The impact on change when it comes to the regional policy, it is somewhat limited. The Supreme Leader himself, he mentioned several times that the Foreign Ministry is just an implementing body for the policies that's set by the Supreme National Security Council, and that's referring to its rules under the constitutions. And therefore, I don't think the Pezeshkian role regionally will be that big. It's just going to be limited to his ability to employ the Iranian diplomacy when it comes to the economy and diplomatic relations, as well as creating regionally acceptable media narratives of the role of the axis of resistance of the proxies in the region. And we can see this yesterday or before 2 days when he supported Hezbollah against Israel. So this is a constant regional policy that it's too fundamental when it comes to the strategic depth of Iran. And maybe the one thing that I can see there will not be a strategic shift. Of course, there are some frameworks and trends will be the same. Like for example, pushing the Americans' influence from Iraq and Syria. But the only change may be going to be, or the places that Pezeshkian can affect relatively, it is the relation with the Gulf countries, trying to make a progress with Saudi Arabia, also Bahrain, in light of the last meetings and indications of resuming relationship, as well as UAE, by the way, because and several times he talked during his debate and after the election about the need of attracting the expertise inside Iran to manage the economy inside Iran, and he mentioned Dubai and UAE several times. So I think this is an opportunity as well to strengthen the relation with the Gulf countries.
Thank you, Fatima. I just want to validate this with you, Mr. Ali Alfoneh. So now there's a lot of, let's say, assumption that there will be no change when it comes to the role of IRGC regionally. And that's understood, of course. But let's think about it in a different way. How can IRGC reduce the pressure that they receive from the European countries through Dr. Masoud Pezeshkian, whether in terms of their regional presence or even international presence? Because lately we've heard a lot of talks in Europe that there's serious steps to designate the IRGC as a terrorist group. So can they utilize his presence or his diplomacy to reduce that huge pressure?
Well, first of all, I do share the viewpoints of Ms. Fatima, but for several, slightly different reasons. Iran's regional policy has been spectacularly successful. This is a country which is under extreme sanctions regime from the United States. Nevertheless, the Islamic Republic has managed to expand its sphere of influence all over the Middle East region. It managed to survive economic warfare of the Trump administration against Iran. It managed to secure and see to it that Saudi Arabia and the UAE, by the way, were not victorious, did not manage to achieve their strategic objectives in Yemen. The Islamic Republic managed to secure the survival of Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria. In Iraq, the Islamic Republic managed, by the way, with some assistance from the United States of America, to defeat, Islamic State, Daesh. All these things, they are victories of the Islamic Republic. Why on earth should the regime change its policies? And by the way, Dr. Zarif, the foreign minister of former President Rouhani himself, these people believe in the regional strategies of the Islamic Republic. So for these reasons, I believe that the Islamic Republic will continue because the policies worked. They were successful.
But Mr. Ali, sorry to interrupt you, but if they really believe in this regional policy, I'm talking about President Rouhani, why did they, let's say there was some leaks that Minister Zarif is criticizing the role of the IRGC and their intervention in his diplomacy. So how can you reconcile these both facts?
These are very normal bureaucratic fights that we also have in the United States between the Department of State and the Pentagon. So this does not particularly surprise me. What I do expect, though, is that yes, Dr. Zarif as an advisor of Iran's the foreign ministry, and perhaps as a vice president, perhaps as a senior advisor, chief of staff to President Pezeshkian, will help the Islamic Republic avoid some of the mistakes of the Raisi administration and the disasters of the Mahmoud Ahmadinejad presidency. But the fundamentals of Iran's regional policy will probably not change.
Thank you, Mr. Ali. Professor Mehran Kamrava, where do you position yourself between Fatma and Mr. Ali in terms of the regional policy of Iran?
Yeah, I agree. Iran's regional policy won't change. And just a couple of notes to add to what has already been said. First and foremost, as far as Tehran is concerned, Lebanon and Syria are Iran's strategic depth. And so Iran's relationship with non-state actors like Hezbollah or the Iraqi militia or its presence in Syria, that is not going to change regardless of who might be the president. As Ali just mentioned very articulately, those policies have paid dividends. Hezbollah has been a very effective deterrence against Israel for Iran, and so that policy won't change. I think one thing that is also key to remember, and this is a point that is not often mentioned or kind of understood, is how the regional Arab countries view the Iranian power structure. Because let's remember that Zarif and Rouhani came up with HOPE initiative, Hormuz Peace Endeavor Initiative, which was meant to kind of bridge the gap between Iran, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. And it fell on deaf ears. There were no takers. And the assumption in the regional Arab capitals was that Zarif and Rouhani didn't have the backing of the Revolutionary Guards, didn't speak for the supreme leader, and therefore their deeds were not worthy of listening to. Whereas Raisi and Amir Abdullahian, the assumption was they had the backing of the IRGC and the supreme leader, and therefore in March of 2023, Saudi Arabia came around. In 2019, Iran's relations with or 2020, Iran's relations with the UAE improved. And so the assumptions of Arab policymakers towards Iran is critically just as important as is the posture of what we see by Iranian.
But Professor Mehran, maybe the assumption, as you said, is one factor. But when you examine the facts on grounds, back then the Houthis was very active in Yemen, and the dynamics were so, I would say, there was so dynamics in Iraq and Syria. So how can you bring an initiative while there is some sort of activism in these countries? Maybe that was one of the reasons behind I would say, the failure maybe, or the disengagement with this initiative, as you said.
Well, the strategic environment changed, and so did the strategic priorities and the assumptions of policymakers, not just in Tehran, but also in Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, Manama, Doha, and elsewhere, and Baghdad and elsewhere. So I think, we need to be also mindful of others. And, this also happens in relation to the European Union and the United States. People in Tehran can talk about negotiations all they want. If the Americans and the Europeans don't want to negotiate, then, we won't have negotiations. So I think, and that's one of the things that I think that people in Tehran may kind of not necessarily be paying attention to, because there's now all this buzz about the fact that Pezeshkian has said we're willing to negotiate. But the question that I would pose is, do the Americans want to negotiate? The European Union is irrelevant when it comes to Iran. They'll do whatever the Americans tell them to do. But do the Americans want to negotiate with Tehran.
Okay, Professor.
That's also a question, a space to watch.
Then, speaking of the Americans, let's move to Washington, D.C., to Mr. Ali, and talk about the international diplomacy or the international policy. Mr. Ali, as we saw that President Pezeshkian or President-elect Pezeshkian was basing his campaign on harnessing the relationship with the West, and especially, he didn't mention the United States, but it was obvious that he's mentioning Europe and the United States. So what is his potential in achieving not a strategic breakthrough, but at least some progress?
President-elect Pezeshkian throughout the campaign was promising some kind of a return and revival of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, with the United States, because that is a key part of his strategy to grow Iran's economy. So one part was distribution of wealth, the other one was to make the cake bigger. And the way of doing this is by achieving some kind of agreement with the US, removing sanctions regime. So he certainly is interested. But he also must persuade the Revolutionary Guard that we talked about before, that if there is any agreement with the United States, and let's say there is prospects for foreign direct investment flowing into Iran, the Revolutionary Guard must be a beneficiary from those foreign direct investments. That was one of the preconditions for success of then President Rouhani persuading the Revolutionary Guard to accept postponement of Iran's nuclear ambitions. He said, we freeze the nuclear program for 10 years, 20 years, and then there will be money flowing into the Revolutionary Guard-owned companies. I suspect Dr. Pezeshkian is a realist. Despite all of his talk of fight against corruption and nepotism and all those things, he realizes that in order to have support from the Revolutionary Guard, he also needs to respect the economic interest and take into consideration the economic interests of the Revolutionary Guard so he can get their accept of reaching an agreement with the US. Now, the much more difficult part, obviously, is who will be the president here in the United States? Will we see Biden presidency continue, or will we see the return of Mr. Trump to the presidency? If Mr. Trump indeed is elected president, will he continue and revive his maximum pressure campaign, or will he do something sensational because he will be coming into government with very new people around him? He may be saying that and opting for some kind of a summit meeting with the Iranian leaders, just like he did with the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un. So there is great deal of unpredictability, but I suspect Washington is more unpredictable than Tehran.
Okay, so you've mentioned reviving the nuclear deal, and obviously that faces so many obstacles and challenges. So Fatma, what is the opportunities of reviving the nuclear deal? And if there is no grounds for such, let's say, deal, what would be the alternative?
Sure. If we go back to 2013, Rouhani was able to take the board of negotiations from the Supreme Leader from the Supreme National Security Council to the Foreign Ministry, and they were able to reach to an agreement in 2 years. The thing is, the case back then was different than right now, because there are a lot of obstacles, as you have said, Abdulrahman. If now Pezeshkian, as what he said, he will go for a new approachment in the nuclear that may be based on flexibility and based on maybe concessions to lift the sanctions or so. If that happened, then he will be clashing with the personality of the Supreme Leader himself, the IRGC, as what Alfoneh said, Mr. Alfoneh, as well as maybe the hardliners in the Supreme National Security Council, as well as the Parliament, and that's for so many reasons. If he wanted to go or to show some flexibility and concessions, the red lines in the negotiations are already determined by the Supreme Leader. He said once when he was sitting with the nuclear officials in Iran that There is nothing wrong with negotiations, but the thing is, when it comes to the nuclear infrastructure in Iran, it should be not touched, which means there is no concessions when it comes to the quantities of uranium enriched by 60%, no concessions when it comes to the enrichment rates itself, or maybe on the nuclear facilities or the advanced centrifuges. So maybe the only gray area that he can play with is the 60% of itself, and this is based on leaks before coming from the Israelis and the European negotiations, when they said Iran maybe will be fine with not going more than 60%, but not less than 60%. This is one thing. Second thing, which is the parliament itself. Pezeshkian, he said during the debate that he will try to cancel the strategic law that's been implemented by the parliament in December 2020, that the government should obligated to implement it. And Rouhani at that time in 2020, he said this is the worst law in Iran history. And that's because it's making obstacles in front of negotiations with the West, as well as making some escalations when it comes to nuclear. So if he said so, this is gonna be rejected by the Supreme Leader himself, because he praised this law several times. Another thing, as the colleagues said before, which is the IRGC is one of the most beneficial from the sanctions. If Pezeshkian wanted to lift the sanctions, maybe they will try to make more obstacles, maybe tensions in the region, in the waterways. And the third, or the last maybe reason, let's not forget, as Mr. Alfoneh said, the American administration, Trump doesn't seem like he wants to go back to the same deal. Maybe he will push for another deal.
Okay.
And
yeah. So, Professor Mehran, as Fatma said, that the strategic law to lift sanctions was criticized at the beginning by President Rouhani, because it undermines the efforts to achieve diplomatic, let's say, progress. But in fact, when you assess the current situation, from 2021 to 2024, this law has enabled Iran to gain a very strong position when it comes to the nuclear infrastructure. 60% enrichment uranium in 2 facilities, huge amounts of 60% enriched uranium. Can you see that infrastructure as a huge opportunity for the whole system to use Dr. Pezeshkian as a negotiator from a stronger position? I mean, isn't it enough for the system that to stop at least on this level and start to negotiate? Because they've already reached the level that they want to, that could offer the necessary deterrence.
Right. That's an excellent question, and that's the question that's actually being asked in Tehran, because as far as people in Iran see it, they suspended the enrichment, they abided by the terms of the JCPOA, and they actually stayed within the parameters of the JCPOA for a year after the Americans withdrew, and they got nothing for it. So one argument in Tehran is, why not? Why not enrich more? And why not, what does Iran have to negotiate with except for enrichment? Because the Europeans and the Americans keep imposing sanctions, not just on the economy, but also on the individual. And so the only kind of card that Iran has that it can play with is to increase enrichment levels. And so, as you say, the assumption now is the rules of the game have changed. There are many more individuals who are sanctioned in Iran. Many components of the economy have been sanctioned heavily. And really the only trump card that Iran has is its enrichment, and what we heard, what was quite interesting is that over the last year, many more people in positions of power are talking in Iran, are talking about breakthrough capacity. And Nasser Hadian, who's a professor at Tehran University, he said, you know what, if Khamenei dies, the fatwa against nuclear weapons goes away with him. And so that's a really interesting statement to make. Kamal Kharazi said the same thing, advisor to the supreme leader in foreign policy area, former foreign minister. So the rhetoric coming out of Tehran has also changed, not just the infrastructure.
Thank you, Professor. And as we promised, we want to make this webinar engaging with our audience. So in the next 20 minutes, we'll take the questions from our audience. And I would like to start with a question directed to you, Mr. Ali Alfoneh. Within Masoud Pezeshkian's limited policy capacity in Iran's political structure, what kind of foreign policy changes will he bring, especially toward major powers, China and Russia?
Dr. Pezeshkian and many of the people from the reformist camp would like to have a more balanced foreign policy, because right now the Islamic Republic is heavily dependent on support from Russia and China, and is in a permanent state of conflict with the United States, to a lesser degree with the Europeans. Now, that's a problem from their point of view, because Iran has become too dependent on the East. So the question, obviously, is if the West is willing to, engage more constructively with the Islamic Republic. So I do believe that he will try to do his best, but I'm also convinced that there are so many institutional bonds between Iran and particularly Russia and the Russian military and security and intelligence establishments that it is very, very hard to change Iran's position. So despite all the wishes of the reformist camp, they will end up doing more or less the same thing than Dr. Pezeshkian's predecessors have done.
Thank you, Mr. Ali. There's another question. I'll read it. It's a bit long question. There are a number of tweets by the Supreme Leader in which he mentioned Dr. Raisi's policy, and he was praising this policy. Also, it was preceded by a recommendation from the Supreme Leader for Dr. Pezeshkian to continue the same approach that his predecessor Dr. Raisi followed. So, Professor Mehran, have you seen these tweets?
I can't say I have, but he did meet, Khamenei did meet with Raisi's cabinet and kind of talked about
وتحدث عن الرئيس باعتزاز.
Of them were from the same traditionalist ideological persuasion. He kind of praised Raisi for his modesty, for his administrative acumen, which is of course open to debate. But there's no doubt that Khamenei had a soft spot in his heart for Raisi.
Fatma, I think you were discussing these tweets before the session. How did you read it?
So I guess the most thing that the Supreme Leader was trying to refer to is the relation with the United States, because in one of his tweets he was saying something similar to that we are open to the relation with all the countries in the world except two countries, which is Israel and United States, and he was referring to something with Washington, and he was. It's like he's given an advice to Pezeshkian to follow the steps of Raisi and his foreign policy and not crossing the roads by, for example, seeking for a direct talks with the United States or something like that. This is what I think he was trying to push for it with the Pezeshkian government.
Thank you, Fatima. Mr. Ali, just I want to reiterate and invoke an interview with President Obama. And he was saying that when we went for the nuclear deal, we were aiming to strengthen the reformists in Iran so that they can have a stronger position, and then they might become the most favorite, let's say, political current within Iran because they brought the nuclear deal. Now, if, as we know, that President Biden followed the same policy almost of President Trump, in addition that there are some voices in Washington saying that we should bring Iran back from the, let's say, the Chinese axis. Are we expecting to see any, let's say, a deal between Iran and the United States? I'm not talking about normalization. I'm talking about something that could at least reduce the tension and pave the road for a new strategic understanding between the two countries, something similar to the nuclear deal.
This is a very good question. Just, one word about your previous question about, why Ayatollah Khamenei is so fond of the late President Raisi. Well, Ayatollah Khamenei is very fond of the, late President Raisi because he was obedient. He would do whatever Ayatollah Khamenei wanted him to do. He had zero vision for Iran. He had no independent thinking, and he was malleable. He could be shaped and formed, and he was obedient. That's why. Now, as for the prospects for strengthening of the reformist camp in Iran, yes, I do believe that, because any kind of nuclear agreement with the United States and improvement of relations between the Islamic Republic and the United States is extremely popular among the Iranian public, who believe that their economy is going to be better. Their way of living may be slightly improved. And these things will make Dr. Pezeshkian extremely popular, even more popular than he is today. So the really interesting part is if his competitors will allow him to make a similar deal with the United States that President Rouhani managed to reach with the JCPOA. Because we also know that among the political elites of the Islamic Republic, no one is really against reaching an agreement with the United States. They just don't want their political rival to achieve that victory. Dr. Pezeshkian said that not once, not twice, 5 times he said this. He said that we political elites of Iran do not want to see each other's success. Therefore, we sabotage each other. As soon as there is any kind of diplomatic breakthrough, we see an attack, mobs attacking the Saudi diplomatic representations in Tehran and in Mashhad. We see the mobs attack the embassy or the garden of the embassy of Great Britain in Tehran. These kind of acts of sabotage, they remind us that the potential for more sabotage under Dr. Pezeshkian obviously is there. But how strong is he? How much of a fight is he going to put up against his competitors domestically? Can he prevail in the domestic debate and reach an agreement with the U.S. if the U.S. is willing to give him a deal? So these kind of things make everything complicated with the obvious extra added complexity of uncertainty about the U.S. politics.
Yeah. There's another question about the role that Mr. Kamal Kharazi can play in bringing Dr. Pezeshkian's government much closer to the supreme leader because of, as we know, the background of Mr. Kamal Kharazi as a previous former minister who worked closely with President Khatami. So I'm directing this question to you, Professor Mehran. Do you think that he really can play a role in this, especially that we started to hear that he's pushing Abbas Araqchi to be the new foreign minister?
Yes, there's a number of figures, Kamal Kharazi being one of them, that act as intermediaries between the office of the presidency and the office of the leadership. And Kharazi is one of those. But I think it's also important to remember that, a lot of this depends, as Ali just said, on how the president and his relationship with the supreme leader shape, and how the president is able to navigate that relationship over time. Ahmadinejad, in his first term, had the support of the supreme leader. In his second term, he started defying the supreme leader. Rouhani's genius was that he was able to put together a consensus of very different stakeholders with different agendas in the political system around the nuclear issue. And the question becomes, to what extent can Pezeshkian form that consensus, form a coalition within the political system, particularly with Ghalibaf and the Majlis and the technocratic body of the political system, to kind of sell the idea to the supreme leader of policies that are in advantage of the Islamic Republic. Let's remember that the supreme leader has said Iran's foreign policy needs to be based on 3 principles: wisdom, dignity, expediency, izzat, karamat, maslahat. And Pezeshkian has been repeating that over the last kind of week or so. Oh, our foreign policy will be based on dignity, wisdom, and expediency. Expediency being the operative word, because it's open to interpretation as to what can be in the interest of the Islamic Republic.
Okay, so Professor, if as you said, expediency is one of the main pillars of the Iranian policy, if Dr. Masoud Pezeshkian will come up with something that serves this purpose and achieve this expediency or the interest of the regime, why we are always making an assumption that he would be obstructed by the conservatives?
Because the conservatives have their own interests, which is not necessarily in the interests of the country. Obviously, their personal or factional interest and the national interest oftentimes converge. And this isn't just conservatives, it's almost everyone else. And Iran is by no means unique, incidentally, in that respect.
Thank you. Also, we have another question here talking about the new government that might be formed by Dr. Masoud Pezeshkian.
Give all the hard questions to Ali and Fatima, please.
We'll distribute it among all of you. So for the new government that will be formed by Dr. Masoud Pezeshkian, is there any potential obstacles that it might face? Is this government going to be passed easily through the parliament, or there are still some challenges that they might face? And this is for you, Mr. Ali Alfoneh, because you are smiling.
This is the tough question. So first of all, well, we know from the memoirs of previous presidents that there are several cabinet positions which are not even decided by presidents. Those cabinet positions are decided by the supreme leader. That is the position of the Minister of Interior, who is also in charge of the police, and the Ministry of Intelligence, which reports directly to the supreme leader, not even to the president. Apart from that, traditionally, not always, but traditionally, the Revolutionary Guard has had its own candidate for the Ministry of Defense. That is since the abolishment of the Ministry of the Revolutionary Guard back in 1989, constitutional revision and change of government. So these 3 cabinet positions are not even decided by the president. Then comes the next step, to which you referred, that is the parliamentary vote of confidence for the cabinet. And I cannot rule out, that a parliament which is dominated by political rivals of Dr. Pezeshkian will try to kill a couple of his cabinet ministers. That would not surprise me at all, just to humiliate him, just to show him his own place, unlimited powers within the political system. So yes, he will be facing many challenges from day one. And he has to engage in politicking day and night in order to govern in an efficient way.
Thank you, Mr. Ali. And we are almost moving to our perhaps last question. And this is for you, Ms. Fatima. Now, let's assume that there is some sort of agreement or some sort of understanding between Iran and the European powers in terms of the nuclear program, or let's say some sort of de-escalation. But there's another factor that influences this relationship, which is the war in Ukraine. So do we expect to see a progress as long as this war is still continue and there are European claims that Iran is supporting Russia?
Honestly, the last couple of days we are seeing some kind of, I'm not gonna say a breakthrough, but there is some smooth transition in relation with some of the countries of the European, regardless of what's happening in Ukraine. Especially when it comes to the oil exports. There are reports talking about France and other European countries importing oil from Iran. Although it's not accurate 100% because we can't verify this, but if it's true, it means that these countries, the European countries, regardless of what's happening in Ukraine and all the reports about Iran sending drones and the manufacturing inside Russia, it means that they want also to have the benefits of the economic relations before the new American administration comes. If Trump comes in the United States as the next president, the oil prices may still be high, and the relation with the European countries will not be like, we don't know, we can't expect how strong it's going to be. So they want to secure themselves, as what France said before. While at the beginning of the Ukraine war, why we don't allow Iran and Venezuela to push their oil inside the market, and this is what we're seeing right now. So I think they will try to have an approachment in which that they will split these two files in two different ways: the economic relation on one side, and the Ukraine and the other political issues and cases with the nuclear deal as well in another side.
Well, I wish if we can continue this conversation, but as you know, a policy for 4 years is not easy just to be covered in 1 hour. But I do thank you for this truly compelling discussion, very constructive discussion. And I think it needs to be updated every time and time, because whatever policy is being said, the environment is keep changing. So I really thank you, Professor Mehran, Mr. Ali, Ms. Fatima, and also I do thank our audience who have been listening, hearing, and also participating through their questions. So on behalf of the Emirates Center for Strategic Studies and Research family, we thank you again, our distinguished speakers and our audience, and hope to see you in a next event. Thank you so much.